Have you ever wondered how close we've come to World War III? I mean, really close. Not the Cuban Missile Crisis that everyone knows about, but something so bizarre, so utterly ridiculous, that it sounds like fiction. Picture this: a single hoax, born from paranoia and desperation, that nearly convinced world leaders to launch nuclear weapons. This isn't some Hollywood thriller. This actually happened, and the world came within hours of complete annihilation because of what might be the most dangerous prank in human history. I'm talking about an event so classified that most people have never heard of it, despite the fact that it almost ended civilization as we know it. The year was 1983. Tensions between the superpowers were at their absolute peak, and one man's fabricated story about alien contact nearly triggered the final war. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a desperate scientist, a paranoid government, and the most sophisticated military apparatus in history almost combined to create the ultimate catastrophe. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how terrifying 1983 really was. This wasn't just any year during the Cold War. This was the year that historians now call the most dangerous 12 months in human history. Ronald Reagan had just announced a strategic defense initiative, dubbed Star Wars by the media, which the Soviets interpreted as preparation for a first strike. The Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. NATO was conducting Able Archer 83, a military exercise so realistic that Soviet intelligence believed it was cover for an actual nuclear attack. In Moscow, Yuri Andropov was dying. The Soviet leader was so paranoid about American intentions that he had ordered Operation Ryan, a massive intelligence-gathering effort designed to detect signs of an imminent U.S. nuclear strike. Soviet agents worldwide were instructed to watch for anything unusual: increased blood bank supplies, unusual government building lighting patterns, even pizza deliveries to the Pentagon after hours. The Kremlin was convinced that America was preparing to launch a preemptive nuclear war. Into this powder keg walked Dr. Viktor Kozlov, though that wasn't his real name. Soviet records from this period remain heavily classified, but what we know comes from defector testimonies and declassified CIA documents that paint a picture of a man driven to desperate measures. Kozlov was a mid-level researcher at a communications facility outside Murmansk, specializing in deep space radio monitoring. His career was stagnating. His research funding had been cut, and he was facing reassignment to a remote weather station in Siberia. What happened next changed everything. On the night of November 15th, Kozlov was monitoring routine radio frequencies when he claimed to detect something extraordinary. According to his initial report, he had intercepted what appeared to be structured artificial signals from deep space. Not random cosmic radiation or natural phenomena, but deliberate pattern transmissions that suggested intelligent origin. Now, under normal circumstances, such a claim would have been met with skepticism and lengthy verification procedures. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Soviet military was already on high alert. Operation Ryan had everyone looking for threats, and the idea that America might have secret space-based weapons made Kozlov's discovery seem plausible rather than preposterous. Kozlov's report landed on the desk of General Dmitry Volkov, a hardliner who'd been arguing for months that the United States was preparing something unprecedented. To Volkov, these signals weren't evidence of extraterrestrial life. They were proof that America had achieved a technological breakthrough that would give them decisive military advantage. In his mind, the signals represented communication with secret American space platforms, possibly armed with nuclear weapons, positioned beyond Soviet detection capabilities. Within hours, Kozlov found himself in Moscow, standing before a committee of military officials and KGB operatives. His story had evolved during the journey. No longer content with simple radio signals, he now claimed to have detected multiple transmission sources, suggesting a network of space-based facilities. He described complex mathematical patterns that implied advanced artificial intelligence, technology far beyond known Soviet capabilities. The committee was fascinated and terrified. If America had achieved such technological superiority in secret, traditional nuclear deterrence would be meaningless. Soviet missiles couldn't target what they couldn't locate, and space-based weapons could strike anywhere on Earth without warning. The implications were staggering and demanded immediate response. What nobody realized was that Kozlov was lying. There were no signals from space, no secret American facilities, no technological breakthrough. Years later, after his defection to the West, Kozlov would admit that he had fabricated everything. Facing professional ruin and personal exile, he had concocted an elaborate hoax, hoping to gain importance and avoid reassignment. He had used his knowledge of radio technology to create false data, manipulated recording equipment to produce artificial signals, and exploited the paranoid atmosphere to make his fiction seem credible. But in November 1983, nobody questioned the authenticity of his claims. The Soviet leadership was already primed to believe the worst about American intentions. General Secretary Andropov, despite his illness, was briefed personally. The dying leader, convinced that America was preparing for war, authorized immediate countermeasures. Soviet nuclear forces were quietly elevated to their highest peacetime alert status. Strategic missile submarines received orders to assume launch positions. The network of underground command bunkers was activated and staffed around the clock. Most ominously, the Soviet Union began preparing what military analysts call a use or lose scenario, the doctrine that demands immediate nuclear response when facing imminent enemy first strike. Meanwhile, American intelligence agencies detected unusual Soviet military activity, but couldn't determine its cause. Satellite imagery showed increased submarine movements, unusual communication patterns, and heightened activity at missile sites. The CIA reported to President Reagan that Soviet forces appeared to be preparing for something significant, possibly offensive action. Reagan's advisors were divided. Some argued for immediate military response to counter Soviet preparations. Others counseled restraint, fearing that American countermeasures would escalate an already dangerous situation. The president himself was caught between competing pressures: appear weak and invite Soviet aggression, or respond forcefully and risk triggering the very conflict everyone feared. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the following days. American forces began their own alert procedures in response to Soviet movements. This created exactly the feedback loop that made 1983 so dangerous. Each side's offensive preparations appeared offensive to the other, prompting additional countermeasures that seemed increasingly threatening. Back in Moscow, General Volkov was pushing for preemptive action. His analysis suggested that if America possessed space-based weapons, as Kozlov claimed, waiting for verification might be catastrophic. Traditional military doctrine demanded striking first when facing decisive enemy advantage. Every hour of delay potentially gave America more time to complete whatever they were planning. Kozlov himself was now trapped by his own deception. Brought deeper into military planning sessions, he was forced to provide increasingly detailed information about the supposed American space facilities. Drawing on science fiction novels and his knowledge of actual Soviet space programs, he invented technical specifications, orbital patterns, and communication protocols. His fiction became more elaborate with each briefing, painting a picture of American technological supremacy that terrified Soviet leadership. The crisis reached its peak on November 22nd, exactly 1 week after Kozlov's initial report. Soviet forces had reached maximum readiness short of actual warfare. Nuclear weapons were being moved to forward positions. Submarines were assuming attack formations, and the Kremlin was preparing to make a decision that would affect every person on Earth. In Washington, President Reagan convened an emergency National Security Council meeting. Intelligence agencies reported that Soviet nuclear forces were more active than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The president faced an impossible choice: launch a preemptive strike against what appeared to be Soviet preparation for war, or wait and risk facing a coordinated nuclear attack against the United States and its allies. What saved the world was not diplomacy or rational analysis, but simple human error and bureaucratic inefficiency. A junior intelligence analyst in Moscow, tasked with verifying Kozlov's technical data, discovered inconsistencies in the signal recordings. The mathematical patterns that Kozlov claimed indicated artificial intelligence were actually borrowed from published papers on computer programming. The orbital trajectories he described were physically impossible. The frequency analyses contained errors that any competent radio engineer would have caught. But by the time these discrepancies were identified, Soviet forces were already at maximum alert, American countermeasures were in motion, and both superpowers were preparing for what seemed like inevitable conflict. The analysts who discovered Kozlov's deception faced a terrifying dilemma. Reporting the truth might prevent nuclear war, but admitting that Soviet leadership had been fooled by an elaborate hoax would end careers and possibly lives. The truth emerged through the most mundane of channels, a routine equipment inspection. Technicians examining Kozlov's recording equipment found evidence of tampering, modified circuits designed to generate artificial signals. When confronted with physical proof of his deception, Kozlov broke down and confessed everything. There were no signals from space, no American space weapons, no technological breakthrough that threatened Soviet security. The revelation should have ended the crisis immediately, but military momentum had reached critical mass. Soviet forces couldn't be stood down instantly without appearing to surrender to American pressure. American intelligence agencies couldn't ignore Soviet military preparations, even if their cause had been discredited. Both sides were locked in a dangerous dance, each waiting for the other to make the first move toward de-escalation. General Volkov, facing personal and professional disaster, made one final desperate gambit. Rather than admit the hoax, he argued that Kozlov's deception was itself evidence of American sophistication. According to Volkov's twisted logic, the United States had somehow manipulated Kozlov into creating false signals, using him as an unwitting agent to spread disinformation. This meant American intelligence capabilities were even more advanced than originally feared. For 48 hours, this absurd theory gained traction among paranoid Soviet leadership. If America could manipulate individual Soviet citizens into creating elaborate hoaxes, traditional counterintelligence measures were worthless. The enemy was not just technologically superior, but psychologically capable of turning Soviet personnel into unwitting weapons of disinformation. Fortunately, cooler heads eventually prevailed. Andropov's illness forced him to delegate authority to more rational officials who recognized a spiral of paranoid thinking that threatened to destroy both nations. Gradual de-escalation began as Soviet forces slowly returned to normal alert status, followed by corresponding American stand-downs. The entire crisis lasted less than 2 weeks, but those 14 days brought the world closer to nuclear annihilation than most people realize. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which involved direct confrontation between known adversaries, this incident nearly triggered global catastrophe based on complete fabrication. One man's career desperation, amplified by institutional paranoia and military doctrine, almost ended human civilization. Kozlov was quietly arrested and disappeared into the Soviet prison system. General Volkov was demoted and transferred to an administrative position. Official records of the incident were classified at the highest levels, with most participants sworn to secrecy. The world never learned how close it came to ending, and most people involved preferred to forget their role in nearly triggering the ultimate disaster. The broader implications of this forgotten crisis extend far beyond Cold War history. It demonstrates how quickly misinformation can escalate in high-stakes environments, how institutional paranoia can amplify individual deception, and how the systems designed to protect us can become mechanisms of our destruction. In an era of increasingly sophisticated technology and global interconnectedness, these lessons remain terrifyingly relevant. Today, as we face new forms of international tension and technological uncertainty, the story of Viktor Kozlov's hoax serves as a sobering reminder. The next time someone claims to have detected signals from space, extraordinary evidence of enemy capabilities, or breakthrough intelligence that demands immediate action, we would do well to remember November 1983. Because sometimes the greatest threat to human survival isn't foreign enemies or natural disasters, but our own willingness to believe dangerous fiction when it confirms our darkest fears. The world survived that November, not through wisdom or heroism, but through luck and the simple fact that lies, however elaborate, eventually reveal themselves. We may not be so fortunate next time.